Introduction. None of the founding generation of American leaders had a greater impact on the American Constitution than John Marshall, and no one did more than Marshall to preserve the delicate unity of the fledgling republic. As Chief Justice of the United States, Marshall led the Supreme Court for 34 years, longer than any other Chief Justice, and he single-handedly established its importance and supremacy in American life. What George Washington was to American politics, John Marshall was to American justice. Buffeted by political adversaries, prepared to do almost anything to stop him, Marshall brilliantly outflanked his rivals. Against a torrent of forces that threatened to shatter the fragile Union, Marshall defended his vision of a strong national government. Armed with nothing more than his eloquence and his gift for invention, Marshall triumphed against all odds. This is the story of the life and times of an exceptional man who mastered the art of self-invention and applied it to everything he did. At a time when all the leading Southern statesmen, such as Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Randolph, Pinckney, and Lee, were wealthy patricians from prominent land-holding families, Marshall grew up in a two-room log cabin shared with 14 siblings on the hard-scrabble frontier of Virginia. His only formal education consisted of 1 year of grammar school and 6 weeks of law school. Yet in the space of 2 decades, he went from being a poor, unschooled frontiersman to become a military officer, an influential lawmaker, a successful attorney, a foreign diplomat, a national hero, Washington's biographer, a congressman, secretary of state, and chief justice. How does a man from such modest beginnings reinvent himself so successfully? And how does a judge transform an insignificant and important court into a powerful co-equal branch of the federal government and breathe meaning and life into an untested constitution? As a young officer at Valley Forge, Marshall witnessed how Generals George Washington and Baron von Steuben transformed the Continental Army from a hungry, bootless band of undisciplined, demoralized men into an effective fighting force by kindling faith in their fight. Learned early from his experience in the Revolutionary War that reality sometimes follows appearances. Marshall loved the theater. Wherever he traveled, he attended performances frequently and often wrote about them. Perhaps the power of illusion and the possibilities of one actor playing multiple roles were what drew him to the stage. Marshall played many parts so well because he was at heart a master actor. In the end, his gift for illusion transformed not only himself but the court, the constitution, and the nation as well. Later, while serving as a diplomat and Secretary of State, Marshall negotiated on behalf of the United States when France, Britain, Spain, and the Barbary pirates threatened war. How does an infant nation lacking a powerful army or navy demand to negotiate as an equal with powerful adversaries such as France and Britain? It was in one of Marshall's pet phrases, an extravagant pretense. Marshall depended on this extravagant pretense to defend America's territorial sovereignty and tried to trade against the ambition of great powers. His diplomatic maneuvers successfully avoided war and maintained the country's foreign commerce. President John Adams nominated Marshall as Chief Justice after a humiliating electoral defeat, and only after Adams' preferred nominee for the post demurred. At that time, the Supreme Court was regarded as nothing more than a constitutional afterthought. The court had few cases, little dignity, and no genuine authority. In designing the new capital, no one had even planned a building to house the Supreme Court. It ended up in the basement of the U.S. Capitol. From the outset, Marshall confronted a hostile President Jefferson and a Republican Congress that plotted to impeach Marshall and much of the federal judiciary. Despite these impediments, Marshall established over the course of his tenure the principle of judicial review and elevated the dignity of the Supreme Court as the final arbiter of the Constitution's meaning. During Marshall's tenure from 1801 to 1835, the court issued more than 1,000 decisions, nearly all unanimous, and about half that number were written by Marshall. No other Chief Justice comes close to that record, and no Supreme Court before or since has issued even a majority of decisions unanimously. What makes this record of unanimity even more incredible is that Marshall was a Federalist, and for his entire tenure, every Supreme Court justice was appointed by a Democratic Republican president who opposed Marshall. Nonetheless, Marshall forged a consensus on nearly every issue by sheer personality and intellect. His humanity and warm laughter helped to win over even the most resolute colleague. He rejected a strict construction of the Constitution, insisted on reading the Constitution broadly as a living document that responded to the needs and demands of a growing nation. Marshall envisioned a modern national economy under a strong federal government. He conceived virtually every foundational doctrine of constitutional law that has guided the United States for 2 centuries. While Marshall's contributions to American constitutional law are well known, contributions to international law were just as important. On the court, he confronted a stream of cases for which there were no clear rules or precedents. He was compelled to create new precedents. Cases involving pirates, slaves, and Indians were especially thorny, and Marshall continually crafted new doctrines for deciding these cases. For 34 years on the Supreme Court, Marshall resisted the centrifugal forces of regionalism and parochialism. He eschewed rigid ideology. He was a consistent voice for moderation, compromise, and pragmatism in the face of ideologues and adversaries. In an era without precedent, Marshall invented the legal principles that form the foundation of American constitutional and international law today. He defended the independence of the judiciary and sanctity of property and contract. He jealously guarded the separation of powers, and he dared to imagine a dynamic interpretation of the Constitution that could accommodate the nation's progress from backward localized agrarian economy to a modern national industrial economy. In a revolutionary time against myriad enemies, both foreign and domestic, Marshall held the court, the Constitution, and the Union together.